Hello and welcome to this sermon. This is for the 20th of April 2025, which will be, of course, Easter Day. And the readings are chosen from the Year C Revised Common Lectionary, but the second set of readings for the day. And the readings are Isaiah 43, verses 1 to 21, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 1 to 11, and the Gospel of John chapter 20, verses 19 to 23. But first of all, a question. Do you know what a haggis is? Well, you might not all be familiar, so I'll spell it out. A haggis, Scottish delight, is made from a sheep's heart, liver and lungs, minced with onion, and then mixed with oatmeal and suet and packed into a sheep's stomach and then boiled. So I'm sure most of you have at least heard of haggis, even if you've never actually eaten it. I wonder, however, how many of you have heard the story of how haggis throwing or tossing the haggis came into being. Well, this is the story of haggis tossing. About 200 years ago, Scottish men would go out to fish Scotland's babbling rivers, catching trout and salmon. To save time, so they didn't have to trudge all the way home again middle of the day for lunch, their wives would go out to the river with their lunchtime snack of a haggis. But often they'd find their husbands on the other side of the riverbank, over the river, but no bridge across the river nearby. So rather than going the long way round to find the bridge or getting their long skirts wet by trying to ford the river or anything like that, they would hurl the haggis across for the men to catch, or more usually, to retrieve from the far bank. And this later developed into the Scottish Highland sport of tossing the haggis. I say it's a story that's reasonably well known, but actually the story is a complete load of codswallop. It's completely false. Talk about fake news. That's it. That story is completely made up. It was invented by a haggis manufacturer who wanted to sell more haggis. And they admitted it was just a PR stunt, a novel way of advertising. But the strange thing is that some people who heard the story believed it. And now and again, you can still find people who still believe it. And let's face it, we can see why. It's such a wonderful story. It's the sort of thing that should have happened, even if it never did. In other words, people want to believe tossing the haggis is real, and so they do. But of course, on Easter Sunday, that begs the question, how do we know the resurrection of Jesus isn't a similar story? How do you know that that isn't a story made up after the event and people believe it simply because, well, it's a good story and they want to believe it? Well, here are half a dozen responses to that sort of question. Firstly, the story of the resurrection comes from the right place at the right time. Not after some 200-year gap, not some foreign field far away from Palestine and Jerusalem. It comes from the right place at the right time. In Paul's letter to the Corinthians, a mere 20 years after the resurrection, he tells those who doubt the resurrection that about 500 witnessed the resurrected Jesus before the ascension. So go talk to one of them, he says. Now, what we can see from this context is that clearly the belief in the resurrection of Jesus was mainstream doctrine within 20 years. There was no long hiatus of a Christianity existing before the doctrine of the resurrection or anything like that. And to be someone who doubted the resurrection of Jesus in any way and to any degree was to be on the outer fringe of the church, needing to be brought into the inner core of belief. It wasn't as if it was the other way round, as though there was a mainstream Christianity and it was people here and there on the fringes that believed in the resurrection. No, we can see clearly this was a mainstream belief within the first few years, within the very beginnings, as far back as we can go in the Christian gospel. Secondly, people reported what they saw personally. We have first-hand account witnesses feeding into our New Testament story. People told what they had personally seen, and those stories become taken up and retold by the gospel writers. So it's not just reports of what others said that they had witnessed. We have some first-hand eyewitness accounts woven into those stories. Now, there are different accounts and they give a slightly different perspective as memories differ and perspectives change. And so we have slight discrepancies of detail here and there in the Gospels concerning Easter Sunday, but that rather enhances rather than reduces their believability. It's what happens when people witnessing an event tell the story back again in their own words. You don't do it word for word, despite standing next door to the other witness that's using a slightly different way of telling the same story that you've both witnessed. So that's the second point. We have some first-hand account witnesses feeding into our New Testament story. Thirdly, even the opponents of the Christians react to the resurrection and the effect it had upon the disciples of Jesus. That's the sort of what we might call secondary testimony that supports the resurrection. The fact that the Sanhedrin and others try to beat it out of the disciples after the resurrection, the fact that Paul was trying to chase them down to shut them up, suggests that something had really happened among these group of disciples that was highly controversial and upsetting the Jewish authorities. Fourthly, men like Homer, Pliny, Socrates, they all knew, as every Jew knew, dead people do not come back to life. There was an exception to this, of course, though, in that the Jewish belief was that there would be a resurrection. People would come back to life, but that would be at the end of the world, at the end of human history, in the general resurrection. The vast majority of Jews believe this. So we're not talking, therefore, about going back in history when absolutely everybody would believe absolutely anything, and people of that age, because they lived 2,000 years ago, were too stupid to know that dead people do not come back to life. So we're dealing with people that are just like you and me, but in a different culture and a different age. And the point being, when the Christians said Jesus has risen, it's not the resurrection so much that's the big surprise. It's the fact that it's happened in the here and now. It's happened already to the man Jesus. Because although the Jews believed in the principle of resurrection, they never imagined it would happen to a person there and then. And fifthly, based on how unusual, groundbreaking the story was, even within the Jewish community, who did believe in resurrection, the question has to be, well, why would you make up a story like that? Why would you make up a story that could so easily have doomed them to being a mere laughingstock? Why not go with the obvious solution when Jesus died of just replacing him, finding another leader of the Christian community, such as James, Jesus' very own brother or half-brother? Other such messianic movements did that. You lose your leader, you find another. Why wouldn't the Christians do that? And why have women as the first witnesses when they were deemed by tradition to be too hysterical and untrustworthy to give evidence in court. So why have the first witnesses to this groundbreaking, earth-shattering news a bunch of women? And why mention that some of them had doubts at first, even among his closest friends, like Thomas? Why include the story that those that saw him first, among them, someone mistook him for a gardener? Others among the disciples didn't recognize him for a couple of hours as they walked the road to Emmaus. Why make up stories like that? Sixthly, the disciples had nothing to gain from inventing the story. To say, you could easily have kept on a sort of Christian faith around a new leader like James, and it be a religious, quasi-political movement to change the nature of Judaism and the understanding of the Jewish tradition. But to go with Jesus, say, this man you crucified was the divine Son of God who has been raised from death, and we are witnesses to that. What could they gain from that? It's not like the haggis manufacturers that wanted to sell more haggis, because the disciples were beaten, imprisoned, mocked, exiled, and crucified for their trouble. What did they get out of making up a story like that? And if it was such a load of baloney, why did the authorities not produce a body? Well, tossing the haggis is a perfectly believable story, and yet it is not true. Yet people still believe it. Whilst the resurrection is a true story, which many refuse to believe. It's a strange old world. Amen.